Click the bell icon to get latest videos from Ekeeda.
Hello friends, we are going to discuss something called as capacity. How will you define capacity now? Capacity can be defined as the ability to do the work. In simple words, capacity is the ability to perform a particular task or a particular work at a given point of time in the given conditions. That can be called as the capacity. In our case, we are talking about something called as the production capacity. So how much capacity, how much capable my machine is in terms of giving a particular level of output or in terms of giving a particular level of production can be called as capacity. The next question we are going to encounter is what is capacity planning? Capacity planning is answering some of the basic questions like what should be produced, how much should be produced, when it should be produced, where it should be produced. All those things will be answered under capacity planning. So capacity planning, as the name indicates, it is a planning where you determine in advance how much quantity or how much production capacity you should install. So how much quantity is required, what kind of production is required, and when it is required. These are the basic questions that will be answered by something that is called as capacity planning. The next thing we are going to talk about, how do we decide the capacity planning? Now, capacity planning is based on lot of factors that are taken into account by the organization or by a firm. The most important factor will be the demand factor. Now, depending upon how much demand a product will have in the market, companies will have capacity planning, that is, they will install that much capacity in their firm, in their factories. Now, based on the duration, capacity planning can be short term or long term. Now, for short term capacity planning, we basically use only very limited resources which can't be changed during that short duration of time. The cost involved is less, the time involved is less, and therefore it is called as the short term. On the other hand, we have long term capacity planning where we might like to expand our organization or business and thereby install new machineries, new refineries, and thereby we will put more money which is long term in nature, which will take more time, more capital, and therefore it is called as the long term capacity planning. The first type of capacity I'm going to talk about is called as the design capacity or the determined capacity. This is the maximum capacity at which a firm or a particular organization will operate. When I'm talking of capacity, I'm talking in terms of machines. So my mobile may have a battery with a capacity of, let us say, 4000 or 3700 megaamperes. In that case, that capacity is the maximum capacity at which my battery can charge and store the overall charge. But in actual, no machine or no battery can operate at 100% efficiency, and this is largely because of changing climatic conditions, because of the tropical heat and many other factors. Therefore, we don't normally use the design capacity for calculation, but design capacity is very important while deciding the overall structure, the material from which I will make my machine, and the strength which will be handled by that machine. When I'm talking about the capacity of a particular projector or a compressor or a particular generator, the generator will be made of the material which can stand the maximum capacity, that is the design capacity. The next we have is something called as the normal capacity. Now, design capacity or the determined capacity, as the name indicated, it was the capacity at which I have designed my machines or my overall structure so that it can make that much as the maximum quantity of output under the given conditions. But in real life, we never operate constantly under the same conditions. Conditions keeps on changing, things keep on changing. There can be substantial time that might be unproductive because of the change in the setup, because of the material handling, because of the machine breakdown, or because of the power failure, and there can be n number of different reasons. Therefore, in reality, I might not operate my machine at 100% capacity. The normal capacity at which I operate a machine, so let us say my design capacity is 100%. So now if my machine operates at design capacity, that means it operates at 100% capacity. But in real life, machines will never operate at 100% capacity. Always, because of the change in the shifts, because of the change in the material movements, shifting of the machines, movement of the machines, power failure, machine breakdowns, my actual capacity or my normal capacity will be always less than the design capacity. So let us say even though my machine has a 100% design capacity, I operate at 80%. This can be called as a normal capacity. Normal capacity represents the average capacity at which a particular firm or a particular plant operates. Third is your actual capacity. Now, actual capacity might be slightly lower than the normal capacity, or it can be slightly more than the normal capacity. Sometimes there might be too many workers remaining absent in the organization, then my actual capacity will go much less than the normal capacity because some of the machines may remain unoperated. On the contrary, on some days there can be no power failure, there can be no machine breakdown, all the workers may be present, and in those favorable conditions I may get a much higher actual capacity. So actual capacity represents the capacity at which the firm actually operates. And last comes the effective capacity. Now, effective capacity is the indicator that how much you have put effective hours in the overall production process. For example, if I sit for studies for 10 hours, I need not study for all the 10 hours. Some time might be lost in between. So if I'm employing a worker for 8 hours in a shift, he might not work continuously for 8 hours because ultimately he is a human being. He is not a machine to operate continuously. In such a scenario, the time lost by the worker because of the lunch breaks, because of the machine breakdown, because of the washroom breaks, that will be taken into account, and I can say if he is working for 8 hours, his effective hours may be only 6.5 hours because 1.5 hour has been wasted as a break. Even during the 6.5 hours, he might not work continuously, he might spend some time having a talk with his colleagues. In such a scenario, I can say the effective time will be much lower than the actual time because some portion of the time will be unproductive in nature. So effective capacity is the capacity at which my firm actually operates in terms of output. That will be called as the effective capacity. Now, what are the factors that decide the effective capacity? There are many factors. The first big factor can be the facilities. The first big factor is the facilities. What kind of facilities are available to the workers who are working in the organization can decide the effective capacity. For example, if I am operating under the air conditioned rooms, I will have a much higher effective capacity as compared to if I am operating in a non-AC room. The second big factor can be the products. What kind of product I am going to manufacture? The product which is easy, simple to make may have a more effective capacity as compared to products which are more complicated and more complex. For example, blending of some of the mixtures at very high degree of temperatures can have a very low effective capacity. On the other hand, blending of some simple mixtures to make some kind of products like biscuits or chocolates may have a very high effective capacity. The next factor is the process. The more complicated process, the more difficult will be the overall calculations and the process and the production process, and therefore my effective capacity might be quite low. On the other hand, if I am not having multiple processes, I am dealing with only one process, and if the processes are more automated, then I will always have a higher effective capacity. अगर आपका प्रोसेसेस ज़्यादा मैनुअल होगा, लेबर इंटेंसिव होगा, तो मे बी यू माइट गेट a lower effective capacity because the human interference is much higher. On the other hand, if your processes are more capital intensive, in that case you might get a much higher efficiency because of better machines, because of better technology. In that case, since the human interference is quite low, you will have a much higher effective capacity. The next factor is the human factor. But obvious है, human factors, how much skillful they are, how much knowledgeable they are, how much well trained they are, that can be one of the big factor. If the humans or the employees in the organization are lazy, they might not give you the high effective capacity because they will be spending most of the times on unproductive work. On the other hand, if the workers are more efficient in terms of overall knowledge, in terms of overall tasks, if the workers are more fit, then they might be giving a very high effective capacity. The next big factor is the operational factors. That is, in what conditions you operate, what is your working environment, how are the other people with whom you are working. If the atmosphere in the organization is very cool and calm, people are cooperative, then it might give a very high effective capacity. On the other hand, if there are too many arguments, too many disputes, and too many differences among the people, then they might not be able to give a very high effective capacity. And last but not the least, there are a lot of other external factors like competitors का approach क्या है, what are the government policies, what is the demand, all those will again be taken into account while deciding the effective capacity. Now, how do we measure the capacity? Now, there is no one standard method or standard technique or norms to measure the capacity, but in most of the cases, capacity is measured in terms of output per hour. Capacity can be measured in terms of number of people that are served per hour, or number of orders completed in a hotel for every 100 minutes or for every 60 minutes. That can be the criteria for deciding the capacity of an organization. So output per hour, output per machine, number of people served per hour, number of people served per employee. It can be like number of complaints solved each day, number of customer calls received per hour. There can be n number of criteria regarding deciding the capacity planning. So in case of a call center, it can be the number of calls attended per hour or per day by an employee. In case of a bank, it can be the number of customers handled per day by each employee. So these are the different ways of measuring the capacity. In terms of capacity, we will be basically talking more about machine here. So for machines, the capacity will be in terms of number of units of output for 1 hour, or in terms of the speed at which I can give the output. That can be called as the capacity. The next part I'm going to discuss is what are the factors that affect the capacity. Now capacity can be affected by a lot of factors. The biggest factor can be the technology. The most sophisticated I have the technology, more better I will have the capacity. So that can be one of the big factor. So if I have the latest technology, more automated technology, my production process will be fast, swift and very quick. Thereby it will encourage a much higher capacity. The other factor can be the manpower. If my manpower is highly efficient, well trained, well developed and more skillful, then they will always give me a very high capacity. The third big factor that will decide the capacity will be the market demand. If I have a very high demand for my product, I will always have a very high capacity and vice versa. For example, in case of Maruti, they have a very high demand for their products and therefore Maruti plants have a much higher capacity as compared to someone like Nissan or someone like Renault, because they have a much lower capacity. The next factor can be the level of automation. What kind of automation I desired in my production process. The more the automation, the more quick will be the production, because human interference will reduce and thereby it will bring higher productivity as well as higher capacity in terms of output. The next factor can be the product obsolescence or the product life. For products like computers, video games, products like mobiles which are getting highly outdated. So for computers or for laptops or for mobiles, the average life of a model is not more than few months, let alone years. In such a scenario, the capacity for such kind of products will be always kept at a moderate level to minimum level rather than keeping a very high capacity, because once the products gets outdated, then that capacity is of no longer usable. And last but not the least, what are the changes that are required in the product design, in the overall product features? The more I require the product to be customized, I will keep a very lower capacity as compared to mass production where the products are homogeneous and the capacity is much higher. Coming to the last part, we'll talk about something called as overcapacity and undercapacity. Coming to the last part, we'll talk about something called as overcapacity and undercapacity. Now, what is overcapacity? What is undercapacity? See, capacity of any organization for production largely depends upon the market demand. And demand itself is highly uncertain. Even large organizations, MNCs, are not able to have an accurate estimate of how much will be the demand. In such a scenario, when I plan my capacity, in actual, my capacity might be much more than what is demanded. That is a case which will be called as the overcapacity. Now, overcapacity is a situation where my capacity is much higher as compared to what is the actual demand, and this may be because I might have got a wrong estimate of the demand while planning the capacity. On the other hand, under capacity is a situation where I have a much higher demand as compared to how much I can be capable of making. So under capacity में मेरा एक्चुअल कैपेसिटी काफी कम होगा as compared to the actual demand, because I might have miscalculated the overall demand while planning. At the planning stage मुझसे गड़बड़ हुआ रहेगा, इस वजह से मेरा कैपेसिटी काफी कम हो गया बट एक्चुअल में डिमांड बहुत ज्यादा आ गया. Sometimes it might happen that the product might become very popular. For example, few years back, a product called as Ekeeda, the two-wheeler of Honda, became very popular, and they never expected that it will become so popular. So at that stage they were under capacity, they were having a under capacity of production, and therefore there is a huge waiting time for that particular bike or for that particular two-wheeler. Let's talk about the factors which will decide whether I should have under capacity or over capacity. Now, what are the conditions which will favor over capacity and what are the conditions which will favor under capacity? Now, in under capacity, we have a capacity much lower than what is actually demanded. So there is always a risk that you might lose some of the sales, but then this is normally done when the cost of installing the capacity is very high. Secondly, the time that might be required for installing the capacity might be quite low. In such situations, I might always prefer a very low capacity or a under capacity. Next, for products which are having a very low life cycle, if the product life cycle is very short, then I know very well that this product will get very outdated very quickly. In such a scenario, I will always like to maintain a under capacity just to maintain the demand supply balance, as well as to avoid the product getting obsolete and suffering the losses in case I install a very high capacity. The next big factor is where your product is in a very highly competitive market, then you may always prefer a under capacity at the initial stage. This is because in today's competitive world, the same product might be sold by n number of different companies, and therefore the survival might be very difficult, let alone having a very large capacity. Therefore, for newly operating firms, for startups, for companies which are recently started or which have recently launched a new product, they'll always prefer a under capacity. On the other hand, in case of over capacity, we always prefer over capacity where we can't increase the capacity in a short time. For example, in case of oil refineries, in case of a setup where I am generating power, it will be very difficult to increase the capacity at the later stage. Moreover, cost can be a big factor. If I start a new capacity center or a new plant, I might go for overcapacity when the initial cost is very high, rather than going for the same cost again to expand. Then one more factor can be the products with a very large or a big life cycle. A product with a very long product life cycle is where we will prefer to have a over capacity, because there is ample time to recover the initial cost and break even or cover the payback time of the project. The next big factor is the monopoly. If your product has a monopoly in the market and don't have too many competitors or no competitors at all, then you can always be assured that your product will sell in the market, and therefore you may prefer to go for overcapacity. Then there are other factors. Sometimes the product or the nature of project might be such that under capacity might not be economical to operate. For example, for a power generation unit, operating at a low level might not be sustainable, and therefore they may like to operate at a higher capacity and create overcapacity. I hope you got the basic things clear. We talked about something called as capacity, we talked about something called as capacity planning, then what are the factors that affect capacity, and lastly but not the least, we talked about something called as under capacity and over capacity, their meaning, and what are the factors which will favor under capacity and what are the factors which will favor the over capacity. Thanks for watching this video. Do subscribe to our channel Ekeeda.